please give a very warm welcome to Hannah Donovan.
Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. And thank you, some people, for sitting up in the front. I like it better when you're up here. It feels like we can have a chat. Does anyone want to move up closer? You guys are like, no. OK, cool. I'll just talk to you from here. You know, it's so great to be here today because this is actually my home city. I love New York. And it's only the second time that I've spoken here, which is kind of surprising. So really great to be in New York today talking to you. All right, let's get started talking about the future of content. This is actually going to be the last time I'm giving this talk as well. So you guys are getting like a special show today, too. All right, let's get started. So my name is Hannah. You can call me Han. That's my handle on Twitter and everything else. And I really like fun. And that's mostly what we're going to be talking about today is fun. So I hope you guys are ready for this. Also, my spirit animal is a tiger. So I kind of like to think of myself as somebody like this. What about you guys? Do you like fun? OK, right? Do you like fun? I love using that question as like sort of like a litmus test at some points. I'll be like, yeah, do you like fun? And people either react one of two ways. They're like, yeah, of course I like fun. What are you talking about? Or they're like, yeah, sure, I like fun. And you're like, OK, never mind. It's a good question to ask at a certain point in the evening where you think things are going to go in a different direction. Anyway, so another person who's a very fun tiger who I want to celebrate today in my talk, because I like to take some breaks, because you can't just like listen to me talk all the time, is this guy here. Of course, I was pretty sad yesterday to hear this news. My heart was smushed. So I thought today what we could do is we could celebrate him a little bit and remember what an awesome person and fun tiger Prince was. And so we're going to take some Prince breaks, because this is somebody who truly expressed himself to the fullest. He just like did not give any fucks what anybody thought about him. He just did his own thing. He was weird. He channeled his inner vibes for whatever. And I mean, that's kind of the best possible thing that we could do on planet Earth in this short time that we have. And I'm going to be talking about fun and self-expression today, too, so I felt like this was fitting. All right, we'll get back to Prince in a minute. I've got more Prince facts for you coming up. OK, so I design for desires, not needs. What does that mean? Well, there's certain things that we make that are like infrastructure, right? It's like, how do you get the water to come out of the tap, for instance, you know? That's the metaphor. Or on the other hand, there's certain experiences that we build for fun, which are like, all right, what do you do with that water now that it comes out of the tap? You want to make a water park, do something else with it? And I definitely design those kinds of fun experiences. And, you know, for a long time, I actually felt really guilty about this. I was like, maybe I should be working for a nonprofit or an NGO or doing something more with my design talent. And then finally, I felt really good and totally OK with the fact that I make stuff that's fun. And that's completely OK. And I urge all of you in your work to figure out what kind of experiences you like working on sooner rather than later, these sort of more infrastructural projects or these more experience-based ones, because they're both super important. But whichever one you figure out you love working on first is going to make you a lot happier. And you're going to have a lot more fun along the way. These are some of the places that my jobs have taken me. So what have I been doing? I worked for Last.fm. I led design there back in the day when we were like a super small team, OG crew. And then I co-founded This Is My Jam, which is a song sharing site, which actually went down yesterday because of Prince, but it's back online now. And then I worked at MTV for a minute as well. Most recently, I was seen at Drip, which is a music subscription service to labels and independent artists. And most recently, I just accepted a new role with Vine. I'm going to be their general manager starting in May. So my work is mostly in music and entertainment, if you haven't figured that out already. I've done a lot with recommendations as well, which I'm going to be talking about today with how recommendations relate to content. Self-expression, obviously, super important to me. Prince, tigers, you get the picture. And social connections. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to start by telling you a secret, actually. My secret is that I grew up without any television. True story, I know. It's actually kind of crazy that they even ever let me in their building. And so I have 5 younger sisters, which is super cool, and I attribute most of my management and leadership experience to having a large family. And instead of watching TV, what we did is we made our own TV instead. So this is a picture of us being super silly here. I don't even remember what we were doing. It doesn't really matter. We made our own TV instead. I also got really, really good at stealing TV from my friends. This is my best friend that lived across the street, and sort of locking in these small little anecdotes about what was happening, so that I could actually talk to people at school and stuff. Because otherwise, it's super isolating being a kid without TV. You can't connect to anybody. You have no context for what people are talking about. You kind of end up being sort of an outcast. And so having this kind of perspective on the pop culture conversation became super important to me. And I really started seeking it out. And when I was older and in design school, I realized just how important it was for me to catch up on this entire canon of TV and movies and all this stuff that was out there. So I had some extra education to do, as you can imagine. So I'm going to take you to London, 2008. That's where I was living at the time. I was working on Last.fm. And at this point, in this year, there was something called Love Film in the UK, which was sort of like a predecessor to Netflix, except that they would mail you a physical DVD in a little package like this, and you'd send it back to them, and then you get another one in the mail. It's kind of a cool system. But the interesting thing about this is that the DVDs came in a little mailer that looked exactly like this. So no images, no wrapper, no DVD case. You have zero idea what it is except for the disc inside, right? So one night, I think it was afternoon, I can't remember. I had been at the pub with my friends, and I get back to my flat, and it's dark and storming and raining. I just remember it being really cold and gross. It was February or something in London. And I was you know what, this is a perfect time to put on DVD. So take one out of the case and stick it in and start watching it. And I'm whoa, what's happening? What the hell is going on my television screen? This is super insane. It was the craziest film I had ever experienced. And there's it's in the future, but it kind of looks like Hong Kong at the same time. And there's flying machines, there's people, but they're not actually people. And I'm whoa, we need to pause this for a minute. I need to find out what the hell is happening. Does anyone know what movie I was watching? Of course, I was watching Blade Runner. And I had no idea that I was watching Blade Runner. I had zero context for Blade Runner at all. I didn't know when it had been made or who was in it or why it was important or any of these things. I had to stop it and look it up on Wikipedia because it was freaking me the hell out. Imagine watching Blade Runner and not knowing anything about it. Bonkers, right? It was super bonkers. I think I was a bit drunk too. Okay, so the thing about Blade Runner is that it was London, of course I was drunk, is that content without this kind of context to it is totally meaningless. It was so confusing to me to be taking this DVD out of a package that had no packaging, not even context to be this is a comedy, this is a thriller, this is science fiction, something like that. And then the second thing is that content without any kind of connection isn't relevant. I had no connection to why this was important to me or to culture. And lastly, this content without any kind of perspective has no feeling. And of course, those were the 3 things that as a kid I had been constantly seeking and trying to get a grasp on to have conversations with people. So where's this story going, you're probably wondering. We've been Tigers, Prince, Blade Runner, you're content, what? Okay, so we're getting to that. Content is now super easy to access, and recommendations are increasingly easier to surface. And so the next design challenge for all of us here is to create this experience around the content. This is what people are going to pay for. This is what is going to differentiate our products from all the other ones out there. So I'm going to talk about 3 types of content. I just want to sort of quantify what I mean by content first. So the first one is this kind of stuff, content that is written or produced in-house, or it comes to you via a third party or an API. The second kind of content is this, user-generated content, right? We all just saw this huge advertising campaign recently in New York User-generated content is just as important as professionally written content. We have to think of it in the same way. And lastly, I'm also talking about data as content too. So even just something like play counts on something or the number of views that something has, that is also content that needs to be surfaced carefully in a way because it's relevant. It helps us get some perspective on what we're about to consume. So before I talk about these things with content and get into this, I want to give you a quick history of the music industry, just to give you a little bit of background about how I'm thinking about this problem. So we're going to do that quick history first. It'll be fun. And then I'm going to give you some practical examples about designing for content through context, connection, and perspective, those three things that I was talking about. And then lastly, I'll finish off telling you about the secret, and we'll be done. Sound good? Cool. All right. OK, so let's talk about access and discovery in the music industry. By the way, who in here is a musician or plays music in some way? Quite a few of you. That's interesting. I always think it's so cool, the overlap between musicians and people that also make technology stuff. It's like really high. OK, so historically, the problems with music and design and technology to do with music and content have been around access and discovery. So the first thing that kind of happened here was all of a sudden music was accessible, and we all pirated it. But this was very early on. We were trying to solve this problem of, like, how do I just listen to this stuff? And it wasn't until probably pretty recently that this was completely solved with things like Spotify and now Apple Music, and there's other services out there too, where we can just be like, all right, cool, this is the thing I want to listen to, give it to me. And so around 2008, this problem shifted to become another problem that we all started working on. It wasn't so much access anymore. It was all about discovery. It's like, OK, cool, people can get what they want when they know what they want, but how do they discover new things, right? And I'm sure you've heard people complain about this or talk about this in the industries you work in. It's like, how do we surface the right content to people, right? It's like one of the hardest problems to work on. So in the biz, we call that discovery. So to talk about these two things, I want to talk a bit about desire, and then this other thing over here called the void. We'll get to the void in a minute. So desire, this is like, when I want this thing right now, I'm going to type Prince into Spotify. I won't get any results, of course, but maybe in Apple Music I will. And this is, of course, through search paradigms or other things like on demand. Now, this is kind of a little bit like, the sushi coming around the cart for us. We can just pick it off whenever we want it. And that's something that now today is just absolutely expected when it comes to content. Whatever you're working on, whether it's to do with audio or images or text or anything else, any other kind of content, people expect to be able to just take it off the conveyor belt today. That's like table stakes. This other thing, this void here, is the trickier problem, which is like, I want something, but I'm not really sure what I want. Like, I want to watch a movie, but I'm not sure which one. And this is where paradigms like browsing for things or recommendations start to come into play. And that's where most of the technology has been focused recently. And this is a lot more like, I like to think about it like omakase. It's like you just sort of want to ask an expert to give you something great. So what does this boil down to? It's like when I know exactly what I want, I already have these three things. I already have context about it, I already have some connection, and I already have some perspective on that thing. Now, on the flip side of the coin, when I don't know what I want, guess what are the three things that I need? It's these three things. I need some context on why it might be cool, I need some kind of connection to it, and of course I need some perspective on it. Knowing what we want is really, really hard. In fact, most people in life just kind of know what they don't want. And through knowing what we don't want, we kind of figure out what we do want eventually. This is the void. This is the hard part. And offering people something that they might desire requires so much of this context, connection, and perspective, this experience that you're going to package around the content. That is what sets products apart, and that is what our job is as designers and developers. All right, so just to finish up this history lesson here, with the music industry. And other things started happening too. So we've talked about up until 2008, and then this discovery thing starts happening, and everybody starts battling it out about the best way to surface up cool content. And this starts happening. It's like computer versus people, and there's like this big face-off, and it seems to be like one or the other in 2012. And then again, this happens in like 2013. There's the exact same panel happening at South by Southwest. And guess what happens in 2014? And I don't even need to tell you about the other years, because you get the pattern here already, right? And this is ridiculous, okay? And if this problem ever comes up in your job or people ask you about this, I would strongly urge you to consider this alternative here, which is both. Because humans, of course, connect us in all sorts of ways that computers can't, right? Humans have perspective, we have heart, we can feel things, at least for now. Computers can't do that yet. Get to that in a minute. And computers, of course, can connect humans in all sorts of ways that we can't, right? We wouldn't be able to be connected to so many people as we are today that are all the way around the other side of the world in different ways if we didn't have computers to do this. So the answer is both. It's both a combination of experts and curation, as well as using algorithms and technology to our advantage to surface up things. And of course, crafting balanced teams that are able to work on these kinds of problems together. And I think no better example actually is than this, which is like not even about surfacing up the right kind of content to people. It's in fact about actually creating the content itself and using a combination of both humans and computers. All right, Prince break? Okay. So did you guys know that Prince made 39 studio albums? That's crazy, 39 studio albums. And his career was only like 37 years long or something like that. Absolutely insane. This guy was like so prolific. All right, let's talk about context. Cool. So context makes content meaningful. I want to start with a quick quote here about context by the incredible designer Mark Bolton. And he's talking about systems for content in this quote, where he says that on its own, content is kind of dumb. It's like something, sort of floating around on the internet, and we need to create a smart design system to display it in the right kind of context. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. And nowhere, I think, is this more apparent than the music industry, because the kind of content that I have had to work with in the past kind of looks like this. It's all over the place. You get like weird metadata, you get long titles that are super long and extra long, you get things in different languages, there's like classical music and mixtapes and like all sorts of combinations of like things out there that I've had to figure out how to work with. Music is extremely messy, and usually when I'm having to work with this content, it's just getting like chucked at me through an API, and it's my job to figure out how to take that like API vomit and turn it into something sensible that people can actually understand. And if you are handed a mess, I like to call it API vomit, it's also your duty to figure out how to make that into useful content. You can't just take it and sort of let the fire hose display on the page. So here's an example of this. When I was working on this as my jam, we were using YouTube as a way for people to share their songs. And as you may or may not know, YouTube serves up like really shitty thumbnails. They're like super small, and they're like crappy looking, all sorts of JPEG compression on them. And you can't quite see it on this monitor, but there's an example of what one of them looks like. And I was like, whoa, how are we going to make this look good? Because we're trying to do a song sharing site that's also all about personal self-expression and how much I love this song. I can't put something up about what I love if the song looks like crap, right? So we took it upon ourselves to take these shitty thumbnails that we got and turn them into something a little bit better. So we corrected the levels on them first, and then we ran them through another filter to add some film grain to them so that you couldn't see the JPEG compression so much. It's a little thing, but it's still an extra thing, and that was something that we chose to do because it's not good enough just to take that content and display it. You have to put it inside the smart system. And then we went even further, which was we looked at a bunch of things that were happening in pop culture and fashion and graphics, and we designed a bunch of these different kinds of background filters for these things. And what ended up happening was something along these lines where users could choose the way that they wanted to display their song. We had some programmatic things in there so that it looked different each time. And it ended up looking something like this, which I thought was pretty cool considering we started with like a super shitty thumbnail from YouTube. But we took it further. Here's another example of context. So we also asked people to start, we thought, what would it be like if people could post a little story to go along these things too, and actually write something about why they love these songs. And so what we did is we actually took the posting flow and we separated it into 3 steps so that it was all about the song and then the image and then posting the text afterwards, which, as you know, sometimes isn't a great idea to put your users through more steps. But what we actually discovered was the number of written descriptions went up when we did this, and the number of jams that were being posted stayed the same. So that's another way that you can also add context to things is, of course, through words. Just to finish up on concept here, to close this concept, so I live in Williamsburg over by the Marcy Avenue stop, and I was standing there one morning, and it was like a really beautiful morning. It looked like this, like super, super golden. And I pulled open the New York Times, and it was like, good morning, here's what you need to start your day. And I'm like, this is so nice. This is exactly what I want right now. It's like it knows that it's morning and that I'm standing here, and I don't have much time. I've got like 5 minutes to read the news before I get to work. And I start reading this article on sharks, because I really like sharks as well as tigers. And look at this right here. It's like, good morning on this golden Friday while I'm like standing there looking at that. And I'm like, how does it know? This is so nice. I'm like, you're right. It is a golden Friday. This is so lovely. And so I tweeted about it, and a bunch of other people saw that too. And it was just like one little way of showing me that they had a little bit more like context about where I was and what I was experiencing at that particular moment. And of course, if you use the New York Times app in the evening, you get a completely different experience because it's like, now we know that you're going to sleep, you're having a different vibe, so I'm coming off the train at the end of the day, and I'm getting my nighttime read instead of the morning read. So another way that you can add this kind of context to your work is just through time and place. It's like really simple little stuff, but it can actually make a big difference to how your users feel like they're connecting to that content. All right, Prince break? So, okay, here's another crazy Prince fact. When Doves Cry, first major R&B hit to have, that's right, no bass line. Have you guys ever thought about that before? It's crazy. You should listen to it. There's like no bass line in an R&B song. Wild. I don't know who else could do that besides Prince. Also, it's something to think about just how the things that we think we need to include sometimes in our projects sometimes aren't actually necessary. Like this is somebody that truly challenged the status quo about what that sound was actually like. All right, let's move on to talking about connection. So as I mentioned in my introduction, connection is what makes content relevant to us. So again, I want to start with a quote. This is from, it says Charles Eames, but I'm going to assume that this was Charles and Ray Eames because I don't think she gets credited with enough stuff here. And this is that the quality of the connections is the key to the quality per se. So that it's all about the connections and how you connect the content to the user, that's where the quality lies. And so everybody's connection to content is pretty different. And I think one of the biggest things when trying to figure out how to connect stuff is that you can't assume things about your user. There's very little that you can assume because my queen is different than your queen, et cetera, et cetera. But the stronger this connection, the more meaningful the content becomes. So the more things you know about that person, the more things you can kind of start assuming, the stronger this connection is going to be. So I want to talk about a little case study. Way back in the day when I was working at Last.fm, we were working on our, I think it was like the second version of our iPhone app. So this is like super old by now. This must have been like 2011. And what we were trying to do at the time was figure out how to make the radio stations play on people's phones, which was kind of a fun project to be working on. And The interesting thing about this, though, that I discovered after we'd worked on it, we knew that people wanted radio stations. We tested it. We put it out there. We started testing these radio stations and the interface and the playback and all this stuff, which I was like mostly focused on. And then it occurred to me as we were watching people use this that actually the problem was here people didn't want to listen to the radio stations. It had nothing to do with the fact about how they were designed. That was all fine, just didn't want to listen to the music. I was like, okay, it's a pretty big problem, right? Back to the drawing board. And it turned out that the reason people didn't want to listen to the radio stations was that we had two at the time. One was called your library, which was sort of the music that you know and love. And then the other one was your recommendations. So this was like, hey, new things that you might want to check out based on this music that you know and love. And sort of from the perspective of technology and how you might build databases full of songs and stuff, this kind of makes sense, right? Well, it doesn't make sense to human beings because it turns out nobody likes listening to recommendations for that long. It's exhausting. People turn it off after 2 minutes because all of that stuff is new. And when it's all new, you don't have any connection to it yet. And this is actually why when you listen to terrestrial radio, they'll play a bunch of hits that you can sing along to, and then something new that you've never heard before, and you're like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then you're back in your happy place again, listening to a bunch of hits. There's a reason that they repeat the same songs over and over again. They do that because it's a very sophisticated sort of system that they've come up with over years to figure out what keeps people happy listening to music. So we started digging into this a bit and realized that what we needed to do was actually create a whole new radio station called Mix Radio, which is what the project ended up becoming instead of this other things. And we launched it, and it was really successful, and people loved it because they had this connection to the music that they were listening to. It was like, oh yeah, I know this one, I love it. And there was this connection of familiarity for them, and then at the same time, we were also able to recommend them new music. So the other thing that I noticed during this time was also that the best music recommendations come from friends. And again, here's another example of connection, right? If your friend says you should check out something, there's a much more strong connection there than just an algorithm suggesting it to you. The other example of connection that I want to show you here is this app, Time Hop. I personally am not a huge fan of reliving my past because it's just not my vibe. I'm always looking towards the future. But I think there's something really interesting going on here. This is a pretty cool experience where people can be reminded of where they were about a year ago. So this is an example of me being reminded of when I was at Teufelsberg in Berlin, hanging out with my sister, which is a place I used to visit a lot when I lived in London. And there's my connection to Berlin, all my stars on Google Maps. I love my stars. If Google ever takes away the stars, I'm going to be devastated because I love opening up the map and seeing my connection to all these places and being reminded of all these things. So connection can also take place through place as well. That's another really easy way to connect people to content. To close that concept. All right, you guys know what it's time for, right? Prints. Okay, I'm just keeping you here for the prints. So here's the other crazy thing about prints, and I put this fact up here because I think given that we are all making things, this is a really interesting one. On Prince's debut album, For You, which he recorded when he was 20 years old, he played every single instrument on the album. There's a total of 27 instruments. Kind of crazy. This guy was wild. But when you think about all of the languages that we learn to program things or different design tools, it actually makes a lot of sense. It helps you build a lot of empathy for the other people that you play with or the people that you make things with by learning all of these different instruments. I like this. Cool guy. All right, let's talk about perspective, and then we'll wrap up and we can be done, because I know I need to do that soon. Perspective is the most important thing that you can have as a designer or as somebody who makes things. I was recently at, or maybe it wasn't so recently, it was a while ago. I was at this lecture at the New School, and one of the young designers in the audience who had just graduated, she raised her hand and asked a question. She was like, what do you think is the most important thing for a designer to have? And every single person on stage, the whole panel, answered it in a different way, but they all gave the same answer, which was perspective, point of view. if you can define what your point of view is on things and have a very specific way of working, that's going to attract people to work with you, because it's all about having a very sharp focus on things. And this kind of perspective is what gives content feeling. And this is perhaps the hardest thing, of course, to do with computers, is to take a stance on things and have perspective. Here's another quote for you to open this moment. And this is from the book, The Moment of Clarity. It's a book about building meaningful businesses, but there's this section in it which I really like. They're talking about Hubert Dreyfus, who's a philosopher prof at Berkeley, and he does a lot of work in the field of artificial intelligence. And it says, humans are human because they have a perspective. They care about things. One might call it our ability to give a damn. And this is this quality that allows us to determine what matters and where we stand. A computer just can't do that. In other words, computers can't give a damn, at least not yet. And so this is something that's pretty important. This is where we come in as humans, and we can add a little bit of curation and taste and perspective on top of the things that the computer has already shown us might be relevant to somebody. Here's an example from Last.fm again. Back in 2009, we played around with this cool new newspaper making service called Newspaper Club, which is actually super rad. It lets you make your own newspapers, print on demand. And so we published these newspapers as holiday gifts for a bunch of different people. And in the middle, we had like a centerfold, which was, we did actually two versions, London versus the world and New York, where we had this graph of the music that people had been listening to and when it got more popular and less. And you could kind of see over here that like this was when like Muse put out an album and like Lily Allen was doing something at the time. But when you just looked at this graph without any of this annotation on it, it was actually kind of hard to parse. It was like, whoa, why is this stuff important? And Last.fm was actually very clear that it was like all about machine learning, and they didn't want to ever bring in editorial. But for this project, what we did was we added this layer of editorial. I hired a music writer, a music journalist to like annotate this stuff and talk about like why it was important and like, you know, why was Muse really popular then. And all of a sudden, it started to make so much more sense, and we were able to put our own particular perspective or slant on these things. Another example is like, I'm just super into email newsletters right now. I think I consume a lot of content that way. And another example of how you can have perspective is just the ethos of a company. These are two I love. I love getting the Stones Throw email. It's like a present in my inbox every time I get it. The Hype Machine stack is also excellent. And these are just built in a way where it's like, hey, this is the kind of stuff that we care about. Stones Throw has a very particular view on the kind of music they put out, obviously being like the home of underground hip hop. And so this is the kind of stuff that you're going to get from them. Or, on a sillier note, this is a ridiculous thing that I made once, which also goes to show that you don't get to choose what people remember you for, perhaps. But it was a hack that I made in like 24 hours, and it's stupid. It's had like 80 million page views and went viral on Reddit like twice. And basically, you type in what you're listening to, and then it tells you what you should drink. However, the reason that I'm showing this to you is that this is just another way to have some kind of perspective on things. This perspective is through what you should be drinking. And by the way, you know, you probably shouldn't use this, and I accept no responsibility if you do. All right, let me close up this concept because I have to finish. So this experience here, this really lacked context, connection, and perspective, and I was confused, and I had to shut it off and read about what was going on. This was like a computer handing me like a blob of content in the dark. What we need more of are experiences like this one. When I was in college, I ended up watching all of the Looney Tunes DVDs, and it was a wonderful experience because I had this friend who was super into animation. He was mega passionate about it. He showed them all to me, and he did this in a way where I could learn why this was important, and like, you know, I had some context all of a sudden for like why an anvil falling on somebody was funny, or like some kind of emotional connection to all these moments in conversation and jokes and impressions. They finally lit up for me with this like really warm heart in the way that he presented it. And I got some perspective on what a classic, beautiful animation style is like. And I had someone who was able to like take the time to offer me these things. That's the kind of experience that we should be striving for as designers. I'm going to close with one of my favorite quotes on design. This is by Jack Schultz, incredible designer, lives in London. And he says, some people, they are wrong, say that design is about solving problems. Obviously, designers solve problems, but then again, so do dentists. Design is about cultural invention. I want you to think about that and take that away with you to your work, that that's what we do. We get to invent culture. And right now, we're in this process of reinventing how people connect with art, because that's what content is, how they connect with the news, how they connect with photos, with video, with music. We're living in this amazing time, like the golden age of television, or like when we can listen to whatever we want on the internet. That's so exciting. That's incredible. And we get to reshape how people connect with this art. We get to create new culture between the person and the content that they're enjoying. So to finish up, I'm going to tell you this story. This guy, Owen D. Young, kind of interesting. He was the chairman of General Electric in the 30s. And at the time, General Electric, they just started selling these incandescent or tungsten filament light bulbs, okay, which are the ones that you and I would have grown up with when we were kids, the ones that I guess are like illegal now that are all getting replaced by the LED ones. But the reason that these light bulbs were so impressive and changed their business is because they were way brighter and they lasted way longer than the ones that they previously had, which are like the hipster light bulbs that you see in cafes, which are kind of dim. They look really pretty, but they don't give off as much light. And he actually gave a speech on culture in 1934, and he came at it from this angle of chemistry, because that's what he was working with trying to figure out how to make light bulbs brighter. And he said that culture represents a synthesis, a putting together of things so completely that the combination has an individuality of its own. It may only be an amalgam. It's better if it's actually a chemical combination. So an amalgam is when you mix things together, right? But a chemical combination is when, of course, it comes together to form a completely new thing. That culture does not exist in the form of powder, a mere mass of incoherent particles. He's urging us to take these things, these particles, this stuff that is floating around, these blobs of content that we may be given through an API or that we're getting through some system, whether it be smart or dumb, and put them together in a completely new way. This is the opportunity that we have. With everything that we make, we have an opportunity for that reaction, to invent culture. That's it. Thank you very much.